this video, we're going to be looking at biodiversity. So in this topic, there's a lot of overlap with GCSE geography, but we're going to be focusing a little bit more on the biological aspect of a lot of these concepts here. But fundamentally, it kind of hang on to one concept, which is we now have a massive increase in the human population. And because of this increase, we have led to a decrease in the biodiversity of the planet. So we're going to look at two major aspects of that, which is how human population increase has led to more pollution and more waste being produced, which affects the environment. And the other aspect is we need more resources from the environment. So we're giving out more waste, but also taking more from the ecosystem, which ultimately leads to a drop in the biodiversity. So we're going to look at these different aspects here, how we have contributed to this, and then finally going to end on how we maintain the biodiversity then. So this is what we call a fishbone diagram. So you can see on the left-hand side, we got an increase in the human population, which ultimately leads to a decrease in biodiversity. But all the branches that are coming out of the fishbone, main fishbone basically, will be how we exactly have contributed to it. So first of all, how have we contributed to land and water pollution? Because there are more people, so there's more sewage, which is normally processed before we release any of the water back out. But sometimes, unfortunately, we can have leakage in untreated sewage, which will lead to pollution. There are more waste being produced, so we're filling up the landfills that we have. And again, because a lot of stuff that in the landfill may not be able to degrade completely, so therefore we are contributing to the pollution there. We are also using more fertilizers to promote crop growth as farmers to make sure that we get enough food. And that's fine on its own. However, sometimes some of the fertilizers might be washed away because of the rain, and they would go into the oceans and lakes, which can cause lots of problem in water pollution. And on that note, there are two major issues due to the fertilizers being washed away. First of all is eutrophication. So eutrophication is where a body of water, for example a lake, has run out of oxygen. So what happens is when the fertilizers run into those lakes, it would increase the plant growth because fertilizers help plants grow better with all the minerals they have. But in particular, the algae, which is usually found on the top of the lake, will grow exponentially because they're small, tiny cells that are able to absorb the fertilizers really, really well. So you get what we call an algae bloom. Algae bloom itself would cover the surface of a lake, which stops the light from getting through to the bottom of the lake. So that means any aquatic plants that are on the bottom of on the lake bed won't be getting light, therefore less photosynthesis, less oxygen is released. They don't make their own glucose, they start to die. And a combination of not releasing oxygen and the decomposition of the dead plants means that all of any remaining oxygen in the lake will be used up, so the animals in the lake will no longer have oxygen for respiration and they die as well. And ultimately, the whole lake becomes a dead lake because of the lack of oxygen. And that is due to the fertilizers being washed off into the bodies of water. And that's eutrophication. And another point is bioaccumulation. So a lot of the fertilizers or even some of the waste products we have in factories that get washed off into the oceans, for example, the smaller organisms might absorb those chemicals, which is not toxic at a lower level. However, when these smaller organisms are eaten in larger amounts by a small fish, and lots of small fish are eaten by a slightly larger fish, then we got an accumulation, a build-up of those chemicals along the food chain. So as we move up the food chain, more and more of these toxic chemicals are accumulated to a point when it's actually a deadly level. So those animals higher up in the food chain would ultimately have health problems due to the buildup of these toxins. So that is how humans might have contributed to land and water pollution and how they actually affect the biodiversity in the ecosystem. On the other hand, we also contributed to air pollution, and so most of the time this is about releasing certain gases into the atmosphere. One major reason for that is we often do incomplete combustion. So the idea of this is that we are burning fuels without using enough oxygen. So in the case of complete combustion, we are releasing carbon dioxide and water vapor only. However, during incomplete combustion, we are releasing Both of those things, along with some of the other chemicals, and all of them together contribute to air pollution. So nowadays, most obviously power plants, etc., will be aiming for complete combustion. But when we are using fuel in our everyday lives, for example, your car, any kind of transport system, when you're burning the fuel, unfortunately, it can lead to incomplete combustion, releasing these chemicals. So one of these things are particulates or soot. So these are basically unburnt carbon, which is released to the environment, which could lead to a few issues. First of all, it could lead to global dimming. So as the name implies, is when there is a dimming of light, or less light can reach the planet. So these particulates can float up into the atmosphere, and because these are basically solid carbon particles, they are literally blocking the sunlight from getting to the Earth. So that leads to two things. First of all, less light onto the planet means less photosynthesis by the plants, and obviously when they start to die because there's not enough glucose, then it has a knock-on effect on the food chain. Secondly, you're blocking the light, which also can block out the heat, so the global temperature actually drops down a little bit, which is not ideal for chemical reactions to occur. Now, apart from particulates, we've also got these different types of gases that are released. So one major one that we are very familiar with would be carbon dioxide. We can also have carbon monoxide, which has one less oxygen, which is very, very dangerous because carbon monoxide actually almost irreversibly binds to our hemoglobin in our red blood cells. So that would lead to less oxygen being delivered around the bloodstream. That means less respiration, less energy. Other chemicals that can be released will be sulfur dioxide and nitric oxide, so NOx, which could have multiple different types of nitric oxides. Now, all of these gases are acidic gases, so when they are released to the atmosphere, they're able to dissolve in the water in the clouds, and when there's enough of it, it will cause acid rain. Now, while most of the time nowadays we don't have that much acid rain anymore, but in the past it used to be a big problem because the acid is able to, you can imagine, raining acid means that animals are going to suffer health problems from the acid. It's going to kill the plants because it's going to corrode some of the roots, and it can cause buildings to break down slightly because of the corrosion. So it can cause lots and lots of issues there. And in combination of all of the acidic gases along with the particulates, together they can form smog, which is essentially a smoky fog. So the idea is that when you're breathing in the particulates or breathing in some of these acidic gases in the atmosphere, as you can imagine, it can cause lots of issues with our breathing system because you're breathing in all these chemicals. And particulates can also cause cancer, so it's not very good for our health. And finally, not to mention that all of these, some of these gases, I should say, could lead to global warming. We'll look at global warming in a bit more detail shortly, but in particular will be carbon dioxide, for example, that could cause that. But more on that shortly. And by just looking at that aspect there, we can see how human population increase leads to more waste being produced, and all of this is affecting our ecosystem. And if we are killing organisms because of the waste that we're producing, that would decrease the biodiversity, which means the variety of all living things. So now we're going to have a look at the other side, which is how we are getting resources from the environment, and how this would affect the biodiversity. So there are two key examples here, which would be deforestation and peat destruction. There is actually a lot of things in common between the two, so we'll explore that now. First of all, deforestation. Sometimes we are doing deforestation, which means cutting down trees, because we want to provide land for agriculture. So this is the concept of trying to grow more crops, or perhaps grow more farm animals to get food. On the other hand, by clearing up more land, where I can actually grow more biofuel, these would be referring to certain plants that we can grow that can be burnt as an energy source. And the same actually goes for peat bogs as well. So peat is referring to half-decaying plant materials. So they're quite acidic there as well. But actually peat would be a very good biofuel on its own. Now, because the peat itself is half-decaying, like dead plant material, it becomes a really good garden compost as well. So in the past, people actually dig up the peat and put it in the farmlands or garden because they've got lots of minerals in there. As they're decomposing, they're releasing these minerals, so it will help with a lot of the plants to grow. However, nowadays, because we realize that the peat bogs are a very very good carbon source, so it's a carbon sink essentially. It's how it locks the carbon inside. So therefore, we are trying to nowadays we no longer use peat as a compost. However, it used to be the case. Now, both deforestation and peat bog destruction would lead to the destroying of the carbon stores. So therefore, we are increasing the release of carbon dioxide. So forests would be made of trees. So if you're chopping down the trees, less photosynthesis occurs, less CO2 is being absorbed. So more CO2 in the environment. Not to mention that when you cut the trees down, you need to process those trees, and one of the ways to do this is by controlled fires. So by burning away the trees, again, combustion means releasing CO2. Same with the peat destruction. Again, they are very good carbon stores, as all of the carbon is actually kept in the ground. So by destroying them, I'm no longer storing the carbon inside the peat, releasing CO2. And as you can imagine, more CO2 means more greenhouse gases in the air. Global warming occurs, which can cause a variety of different issues, as we can see shortly. Now, forests and the peat bogs are also very unique habitats. So this is where living things actually take shelter and live in. So by destroying the forests, you are destroying the habitats. The peat bogs in particular, actually, they are a very unique ecosystem because of its acidity. So there might be very special organisms that are in the peat bogs that we haven't discovered yet. So by destroying the peat bogs, I'm destroying their habitat. These organisms will die before we can discover them, which means that we're losing potential sources of food and medicine. So you can see, by taking resources from the environment through these two methods, we are contributing to all of these issues in the decreasing biodiversity. So looking at all of these things so far, we have been releasing the waste products into the environment, and also destroying some of the habitats as well. And all of this can lead to an increase in greenhouse gases, which ultimately leads to global warming. So we're going to take a look at that now. So no matter if it was through combustion or through other means, we are releasing more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Now, exam questions may ask you to state what are the greenhouse gases. Make sure you know that there are 3 that you need to be aware of. Carbon dioxide is the one that most people know. Methane is another one, which on its own is it's a natural gas, is a fuel. However, it also, when released, it's a greenhouse gas. And a third one that people tend to forget is water vapor, which surprisingly can be a greenhouse gas as well. So what's the issue with releasing greenhouse gases? First of all, this leads to global warming, which is about trapping the heat inside. So the greenhouse gases are able to absorb the infrared radiation reflected from the planet, and they are basically reflecting the heat and keeping it inside the atmosphere, leading to a global temperature increase. And the consequences can be severe. First of all, it will lead to climate change. So as the name implies, it is about how we got more extreme weather patterns. So there are more storms, or there are more storms happening, or hurricanes happening, which leads to more rainfall. On the other hand, an increase in global temperature would also mean that in the Arctic areas, the ice caps can start to melt. And both of these things, no matter if it's more rainfall or ice caps melting, it could lead to flooding in coastal areas. And that flooding in the coastal areas means that you are destroying the habitats in those coastal areas. Again, destroying habitat means organisms will start to die because of the lack of food or the lack of shelter. Other examples of climate change will be droughts as well, which is obviously different from flooding, but again, a complete lack of water would also mean plants can't grow. Again, we're losing the food source for other animals, and then we have a knock-on impact on the food chain. So you can see now how an increase in human population could lead to more waste, which is more pollution, and we're also taking more resources from the environment, leading to global warming in a lot of these sense, and all of these things could decrease biodiversity. On that note, I want to explain a little bit more about how all of these things could lead to a drop in biodiversity. I've already mentioned a few. I'm going to summarize it now. So first of all, biodiversity, as the name implies, is the variety of all living things in in the ecosystem. So you might be asked a definition question on this. First of all, one of the most major impacts of that is that we are killing organisms. This could be due to us directly killing them due to pollution, or it could be a knock-on effect on the food chain, as we mentioned in the ecosystem interactions or interdependence in the previous videos. Part of that is about habitats being destroyed, and that means less shelter, organisms would be killed. All of that, when organisms are dying, that means we are losing potential new sources for food and medicine. Another thing that it could be mentioned is that because of the global temperature changing, it could lead to a change in the species distribution. Now, part of that could be because of the temperature changes, which means that some of the animals that are usually migrating in certain during the season changes, they can no longer tell what season it is, or at least not accurately. So that would mean that results in a change in the migration pattern. So they might be migrating a bit too early or a bit too late. And because of that, that means you're changing the dynamics within the two different ecosystems, the place that they emigrated from and the place that they're immigrating to. That will have a knock-on impact on the species distribution, as you can imagine, and because of that, as we mentioned, interdependence in the previous videos, that would affect the food chain, because that means that they're now having new competition or new kind of predation in those ecosystems, which ultimately leads to a change in the population sizes. So again, that could lead to some organisms dying a bit too quickly, and if in the worst case scenarios, it could lead to extinction as well. So a drop in biodiversity could have all of these different consequences. So it's really important that we, as humans, actually think about how to manage this one, not only because there is a moral sense here, but we also want to think about, in a more selfish sense, how it might actually benefit us, because we need some of these organisms as new food or medicine sources. So we need to consider how to maintain biodiversity to keep this environment stable. So there are 5 main ways to maintain biodiversity that you need to be aware here. First of all, we've got captive breeding programs that can happen in zoos, for example. So this is mostly about endangered species that we might be keeping in a zoo, and to try and protect them, to stop them from being hunted or killed in the environment. But in order to increase, shall we say, the population sizes, because they're endangered, then we can basically allow some of these organisms to breed to increase the population numbers. So one thing to know about breeding programs is that we want to avoid inbreeding. So for a few reasons. Number one, we want to reduce the chance of the offspring inheriting 2 recessive alleles, which could lead to inherited disorders. I mean, they're already low in numbers. We want to increase the chance of their survival. And secondly, if we ever get to release these organisms back into the wild, like animals, we want to increase the genetic variety to ensure that they're able to survive in an ever-changing environment. So avoiding inbreeding is very important. Secondly is to protect rare habitats. So some of these habitats, they're rare because they're the abiotic factors, for example, that they have would be quite unique, and that would allow very different or special organisms to survive in those environments. And again, we want to make sure we protect them and not lose them because of the changing environment. So some examples of that will be coral reefs, for example. In this case, they actually have the highest biodiversity on the planet, and there are very important medicines, for example, that could be found in some species of corals. As an example, I think there is a leukemia drug that was discovered that are made from a chemical made by the coral. So if we can protect the coral reefs and stop them from dying, we're perhaps able to discover new drugs that we can use to treat rare diseases. Third way is to reintroduce hedgerows and field margins, especially in farming. So a lot of times that farmers don't want to they don't want to have the field margins because you want to maximize the amount of plants that you can grow, which you can sell for profit. However, the hedgerows, for example, which are basically these bushes, They are actually a habitat on its own, so lots of different small animals can live in the hedgerows. So by destroying them, we are destroying their habitat. They don't have shelter, they can die easily. So by reintroducing these hedgerows and field margins, we're not only just providing these habitats again for the animals, but there are also two benefits for the farmers. So first of all, the roots of the hedgerows can actually help maintain soil integrity. So by replanting these hedgerows, I can decrease soil erosion, which means more minerals and more water can be retained, actually making any other crop plants that they grow better. And on the same concept there, because I'm retaining more of the minerals, I am increasing the soil fertility. So it's actually in the farmer's interest to reintroduce these hedgerows and field margins, because yes, they may be growing slightly less plants as crop plants. However, it will make any crop plants that they grow to be of better quality. And the government actually can have certain incentive schemes to put in place to encourage the farmers to replant these hedgerows by basically providing them with funding and money to make sure they don't miss out on the profit. A fourth method is to decrease deforestation and reducing CO2 emission. So as we mentioned earlier, deforestation will release more CO2 to the environment, and we are also, through combustion of fuel, we are releasing CO2. So we can try to reduce both of these things to reduce the level of CO2, which means less greenhouse gases. Global warming can slow down a little bit. Finally, we have recycling. So in order to reduce the amount of waste products in the landfills, we can try to use more recyclable materials. So nowadays we obviously have a well-established schemes of recycling cardboard and plastic and glass and cans. And the idea is, again, less waste in the landfills means less pollution. And that ultimately means less animals are dying. So these are the 5 ways to maintain biodiversity. So this is the summary of how an increase in human population can ultimately lead to a drop in biodiversity, what are the impacts of that, and also on that concept, how do we try to maintain the biodiversity for the benefits of obviously the ecosystem and for us ultimately. If you're doing separate biology as well, then there will be another video looking at some of the additional content in terms of how we might consider how the ecosystem might be structured a little bit more, and also how when we're maintaining biodiversity, how do we consider food security as well. So make sure you watch that video next.